I have learned that memory does not arrive all at once. It comes the way damp comes into old wood quietly, without permission, until the structure itself begins to soften. Tonight, as my hands tremble against this table, and the lamp thins the dark just enough to breathe, I feel the river again. Not the way it looks now in the distance, tame and narrowed by years of use, but as it was when I was a younger man and still believed my name belonged to God. They told me the river was a blessing, that its steady passage was proof of divine order. I believed them, because belief was easier than listening. I was appointed overseer when my beard was still black, and my back had not yet begun to stoop. The title sounded clean then. Responsible, almost holy if spoken carefully. I was told I would keep order along the waterway, oversee labor, keep the book straight, and see that souls did not drift too far from salvation. It was explained as stewardship. Everything was stewardship in those days. Land, bodies, time, even mercy was something to be managed. The river marked our days. It woke before we did and never seemed to rest, sliding past the banks with the patience of something that knows it will outlive all weaknesses. In the mornings, mist would cling low, like breath held too long, and the light would stretch itself across the surface in broken pieces. I remember standing there with my boots sinking slightly into the mud, Bible tucked beneath my arm, telling myself that this was good work, necessary work, the kind that kept chaos at bay. I spoke often of order. I spoke of Scripture and obedience, of how every man had his station, and how peace came from knowing where one belonged. Those words sat easily on my tongue then. They tasted of authority and borrowed righteousness. When I repeated them enough, I could almost forget the way the river carried sound, how a whispered plea could travel farther than intended, how silence itself seemed to listen. We did the baptisms early, before the sun rose too high. Water is more forgiving when it is cool, or so I told myself. I would roll my sleeves, step into the shallows, and feel the current press against my legs like a question I refused to answer. I recited the words I had been taught, careful not to alter a syllable, careful to keep my voice steady. I told them this water was cleansing, that it marked a beginning. I believed that saying it made it true. At first, I felt something like pride, a solemn pride, the kind that disguises itself as duty. I told myself I was bringing light into dark places, that I was ensuring souls were properly named before God. It comforted me to imagine heaven arranged more fairly than earth. That thought helped me sleep when the nights were quiet enough to think. But the river never let me forget itself. Even when I turned away, I could feel it behind my eyes, moving. I began to notice how quickly ritual fit into routine, how easily prayer could be scheduled between calls and transactions. The water did not protest. It accepted everything, blessings, curses, reflections, without distinction. That should have warned me. There were days when the mothers stood close to their children, hands resting on small shoulders as though anchoring them to the earth. I told myself not to linger on such details. Sentiment, I believed, was dangerous. It loosened resolve. It made the work harder than it needed to be. Still, those images return now with a clarity that startles me, the way a child's fingers curled into cloth, the way a woman's eyes stayed fixed on the river, as if it might remember her name longer than anyone else would. Before I go further, while my voice still holds, if you wish to hear more of these forgotten confessions, to stay with me as memory loosens its grip, then remain here, and subscribe, and listen to what I have not yet said. I once believed silence was a form of mercy, that if I did not speak certain thoughts aloud, they would wither on their own. But silence has a way of preserving things. It keeps them intact, waiting. The house I live in now creaks with age, the boards soft beneath my steps, but the quiet inside it feels heavier than any noise I remember from those years. It is the same quiet that followed the prayers by the river, when the words had been spoken, and there was nothing left to say. I thought faith was something solid then, something you could lean against without fear of collapse. I did not yet understand how easily it hollows, how repetition can scrape meaning thin until only the shape remains. I kept my Bible clean. I kept my records precise. I kept my conscience folded neatly where it would not interfere, and all the while the river kept moving, patient and unburdened, carrying reflections I no longer recognize. Now, as breath comes shorter and memory presses closer, I begin to see that the calm I remember was not peace. It was preparation, the kind that makes room for what follows by pretending nothing is wrong. I did not know then how much the water would remember me, how long it would wait. The baptisms became expected, folded into the rhythm of the place like the ringing of a bell or the turning of soil. I remember how the men would line them up along the bank, bare feet sinking into the damp earth, shoulders tense beneath borrowed shirts. I told myself the river did not see color or station, only souls. That was a lie I learned to speak gently, the way one speaks to a child who is already afraid. I would step forward with the book open, its pages already warped from years of moisture and handling. The words were familiar enough that I no longer needed to look down, but I did anyway. It felt safer to let my eyes rest on ink rather than faces. Ink does not plead. Ink does not remember your name after you have walked away. I spoke of rebirth. I spoke of cleansing, of sins washed downstream and forgotten. The river slid past my knees, cool and steady, and for a moment I could almost believe what I was saying. There is a dangerous comfort in repetition. Say a thing often enough, and it begins to sound like truth, even when it asks nothing of you in return. Some of them trembled when I lowered them into the water. Others were very still, as though they had already learned that resistance only prolongs the moment. I placed my hand where I had been taught to place it, firm but not unkind, and I murmured the blessing as the current closed briefly over their heads. When they rose again, gasping, water streaming down their faces, I told myself that grace looked like that, sudden, unchosen, inescapable. What I did not tell myself not then was how quickly I would dry my hands afterward, how I would step back onto the bank, shake the water from my cuffs, and begin thinking of the day's other obligations. There were numbers to be checked, schedules to be kept. The river allowed no pause, and neither did the system that fed from it. I believed, truly believed, that I was doing something good. That belief insulated me. It wrapped around my thoughts and dulled their edges. I had been taught that obedience mattered more than understanding, that doubt was a temptation best ignored. So when a voice inside me whispered that something was misaligned, that the words of salvation rang strangely beside the language of sale, I tightened my grip on Scripture and spoke louder. There were mornings when the light fell just right, turning the water pale and almost beautiful. On those mornings I felt closest to righteousness. Beauty has a way of absolving things it should not. I mistook the quiet dignity of the ritual for moral clarity, mistook stillness for consent. The river did not contradict me. It never did. I noticed, though, how the baptisms grew faster, how reverence gave way to efficiency. The words shortened. The pauses disappeared. What once felt solemn began to feel procedural, another task completed before the heat set in. I did not protest this change. I welcomed it. It meant less time for thought. Children were sometimes baptized with their parents, small bodies lifted awkwardly, eyes wide as water closed over their faces. I told myself they would not remember. That mercy, I decided, could be measured in forgetfulness. Even now, that thought curdles in me. I wonder what the body remembers when the mind is taught not to. There was a particular morning, I cannot tell you the date, only the feeling of it, when I realized how cleanly faith had fused with commerce. The baptisms ended, and before the water had fully settled, I was already discussing transport, timing, profit. The transition was seamless. That should have frightened me. Instead, it impressed me. I mistook my own numbness for strength. I began to sense that the river was keeping count in a way I was not. That while I recorded names and figures in ledgers that would yellow and crumble, something else was recording the weight of what passed through its current. This thought unsettled me, so I learned to push it aside. I told myself water has no memory. I told myself God would sort the rest. Looking back now, from the thin edge of breath I occupy, I see that this was the moment the first real crack formed. Not a dramatic break, just a hairline fracture running quietly through belief. I continued as before, convinced that so long as I followed the words exactly, the meaning would take care of itself. I did not yet understand how much harm can be done by a man who never believes he is choosing anything at all. The children are the hardest to hold in my thoughts, which is perhaps why they return so often. Memory has a cruel instinct for what we most wish to misplace. I see them as they were then, not yet separated, clustered close to their mothers as if proximity alone might protect them. The air in the mornings was damp enough to cling to skin, and their clothes carried the faint smell of river water long after the baptisms were finished. I remember telling myself that this closeness was temporary, that all things in life were temporary, and that acceptance was a form of wisdom. They stood quietly for the most part. Children learn silence quickly when it is required of them. Some clutched at skirts or sleeves, small fingers pressing into fabric with a desperation that had no language yet. I noticed these things and trained myself not to linger on them. Attention, I believed, was a kind of indulgence. It led to softness, and softness led to disorder. There were moments when a child would look directly at me, not with fear, not even with anger, but with a plain, searching curiosity. Those looks unsettled me more than any plea could have. A plea can be dismissed as desperation. Curiosity suggests expectation. It asks something of you that cannot be answered with rules. I learned to lower my gaze at those moments, to focus instead on the tasks that frame the day. Buckles to be checked, lists to be reviewed, boats to be prepared. The machinery of it all provided a comfort of its own. When everything has a place, responsibility feels diluted. It spreads thin enough that no single hand seems to hold it. The mothers rarely spoke. Silence wrapped around them like a second skin, worn from necessity. When they did speak, it was often to soothe, to quiet, to prepare. I mistook this restraint for acceptance. I told myself that grief expressed quietly must be less severe. That was another lie I allowed to settle into me without resistance. The baptisms of the children were brief. I told myself they were too young to understand, that the words were for heaven, not for them. Still, I remember the way some of them gasped when lifted from the water, eyes wide, breath uneven. Water is an unforgiving teacher. It introduces itself without explanation. Afterward, I would watch as they were dried and dressed, return to their places beside their mothers. For a while, nothing had changed. That sameness was deceptive. It allowed me to pretend that the future had not already begun to rearrange itself around them. I have learned too late that the most violent moments are often the quietest. There were days when I sensed hesitation in myself, a pause before the next instruction, a weight in my chest that did not belong there. In those moments, I leaned harder on doctrine. I reminded myself that I was not the author of these arrangements, merely their caretaker. That belief kept my hand steady, even as something inside me began to corrode. The river reflected all of this without comment. Faces, sky, movement all flattened into a single trembling surface. Sometimes I wondered what it would look like if the water refused us, if it rose up or turned away. That thought frightened me enough that I pushed it aside. I preferred a world that did not argue. Years later, I would understand that what frightened me was not judgment, but recognition. The idea that something beyond human order might see us clearly, without the softening layers of habit and scripture. The children laughed sometimes, usually at things I could not hear from where I stood. Back then, I was not ready to be seen. That laughter cut through me in unexpected ways. It did not belong in the careful architecture of control we had built. Joy is difficult to manage. It resists measurement. I found myself resenting it, though I did not know why. I told myself again and again that this was not my doing, that I had inherited a system, a way of life, a set of truths that predated me. There is a peculiar comfort in believing oneself small. It excuses inaction. It turns moral failure into inevitability. Now, as the past presses closer and the present thins, I see how deliberate my blindness was, how carefully I curated what I allowed myself to notice. The children did not disappear all at once. They faded from my daily sight in stages, like a photograph left too long in the sun. By the time they were gone, I had already trained myself not to look for them. That is how decay begins, not with violence, but with omission, with the quiet decision to turn away just enough that the world can change without your consent. The days of sale arrived without ceremony. No bell was rung, no prayer offered beyond the ones I murmured privately, and even those felt thin, more habit than appeal. The river was there, as it always was, moving with the same indifferent patience, its surface broken now by boats drawn close to the bank. Wood creaked softly, ropes tightened, and the air carried the mixed scents of damp earth and tar. I remember thinking how ordinary it all seemed, and how that ordinariness unsettled me more than any spectacle could have. I stood where I had stood so many times before, near enough to see but far enough to remain untouched. Orders passed through me rather than from me, or so I liked to believe. I repeated instructions in a voice trained to sound neutral, neither cruel nor kind. Neutrality became my refuge. It allowed me to imagine myself as a conduit rather than a cause. The separations did not happen all at once. That, too, was a mercy of sorts, a staggered unraveling that prevented any single moment from bearing the full weight of what was being done. Children were led away first, small hands pulled from familiar grips, their confusion still forming into fear. I watched mothers straighten their backs, their faces tightening into expressions I did not yet know how to read. I told myself that composure meant resilience. I did not understand then how composure can be a final defense. The river bore witness to each departure. Boats pushed off slowly, as if reluctant, their wakes spreading outward and dissolving almost immediately. I found myself fixating on those wakes, on how quickly the water smoothed itself again. It was a useful image. It suggested that disruption was temporary, that all things eventually returned to balance. I leaned on that thought heavily. Faith in those moments felt mechanical. I reached for scripture the way a man reaches for a familiar tool, not because he believes in it, but because it is there, and he knows how to use it. The words passed my lips without resistance, without heat. They did not warm me. They did not wound me. They simply occupied the space where doubt might have grown. There was a moment, I can see it now with painful clarity, when a woman turned her head toward me as her child was led away. Our eyes met. Hers held something I had no name for then, a depth that did not beg or accuse. It observed, It recorded. I felt, in that instant, as though I had been weighed and found wanting by someone whose judgment did not require language. I broke the gaze first. After the boats had gone, the riverbank felt strangely hollow. Sound returned in pieces, footsteps, murmured words, the rustle of clothing, but something essential had been removed. I walked the length of the shore as though inspecting for damage, my boots leaving shallow impressions that filled quickly with water. Even then, the river was eager to erase evidence. That night, I told myself that order had been preserved, that the day had unfolded as expected. I ate my meal, recorded the necessary details, and retired without incident. This routine steadied me. It suggested continuity, a world still governed by predictable sequences. Only later did I realize how much effort it took to maintain that illusion. In the days that followed, the river seemed louder, or perhaps I had simply learned to hear it differently. The slap of water against the bank carried an insistence that unsettled me. I began to dream of currents pulling at my legs, of voices just beyond reach. I woke with the taste of river water in my mouth and told myself it meant nothing. The baptisms did not stop immediately. Ritual has a way of outlasting its context. I continued to speak of cleansing and renewal, even as the faces before me changed, even as absence became the most noticeable presence of all. Each prayer felt increasingly detached from its object, like a letter sent to an address that no longer existed. I sensed dimly that something irreparable had occurred. Not in the grand sense the world continued. The work continued, but within me. A boundary had been crossed so quietly that I could not point to the moment it happened. I only knew that the river, which had once felt like a tool, now felt like an archive, and I was afraid of what it had stored. Afterward, I began to speak to myself more than to anyone else. Justifications took on a private life, whispered in the narrow spaces between thought and sleep. I told myself that order required sacrifice, that history had always demanded its share of suffering, and that my role was too small to alter its course. These explanations settled into me like dust, thin but persistent, coating everything they touched. I returned often to Scripture, not for guidance, but for defense. I selected verses the way a man selects stones to build a wall, stacking them carefully to block out what lay beyond. Obedience, authority, submission. Each word became a shield I raised against the quiet knowledge that obedience without conscience is merely a different shape of cruelty. There were moments when the river contradicted me, not in any dramatic way but through repetition. It flowed past the same points again and again, unchanging in direction, yet never the same water twice. I began to sense a rebuke in that persistence, a reminder that movement does not erase responsibility. The thought irritated me. I preferred stillness. Stillness allows things to be preserved as they are. I told myself that I was not unkind, that I did not strike or shout, that I conducted myself with dignity. These distinctions mattered greatly to me at the time. They allowed me to imagine a moral gradient where I stood on the safer side. I did not yet understand how meaningless such gradients are to those standing beneath them. At night, the house felt too large. Sounds traveled strangely through its corridors, amplified and distorted by age and emptiness. A door settling in its frame could jolt me awake, heart racing, mind already reaching for explanations. I began to leave a lamp burning, telling myself it was for safety. In truth, I feared what the dark allowed me to hear. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. Dreams repeated themselves with minor variations, always circling the same images: water closing over faces, hands slipping free, a voice speaking my name from somewhere I could not see. I woke from these dreams with a sense of accusation, that no morning light could fully dispel. Still, I rose and went about my duties. Habit is a powerful anesthetic. I noticed changes in myself that I could not easily explain. A tightening in my chest when the river came into view. A reluctance to linger where I once stood comfortably. I told myself it was age, or weather, or any number of harmless things. Naming the true cause would have required me to act, and action was precisely what I sought to avoid. The community continued to treat me with respect. That too was a comfort and a curse. Their trust reinforced my belief that I could not be entirely wrong. After all, wrongness, I thought, announces itself. It arrives with conflict and consequence. It does not slip quietly into place, admired and affirmed. I began to understand, in a distant way, how systems sustain themselves, not through force alone, but through the willing participation of those who benefit from them. I was not blind to this realization, but I was not brave enough to follow it to its conclusion. Insight without courage becomes another form of evasion. The river remained unchanged, or so it seemed, yet I felt increasingly out of place beside it, as though it had begun to outgrow me. I caught my reflection in its surface one afternoon, and was startled by how unfamiliar I looked. Older than I felt, more rigid, less alive. The water distorted my features, stretching and blurring them until I could no longer be certain where I ended, and the current began. In those moments, a question pressed itself forward. If I had spoken differently, acted differently, would anything truly have changed? I answered myself quickly, dismissively. One man, I insisted, cannot alter the shape of a river. It took me many years to realize how carefully that metaphor absolved me. The nights became longer, or perhaps my patience for them grew shorter. Darkness settled into the house early, seeping through the walls as though it had been invited. I would sit at the small table near the window, listening to the river, even when it could not be heard, its imagined movement threading through my thoughts. There are sounds the mind learns to produce on its own when it no longer trusts silence. I began to mark time by my unease. Some evenings passed with only a dull heaviness, a weight I could carry if I did not examine it too closely. Others arrived sharp and sudden, filled with a restlessness that sent me pacing from room to room. The floorboards knew my steps well by then. They answered me with creaks and sighs that felt uncomfortably like conversation. Faith, once a refuge, became an obligation I fulfilled out of habit. I knelt because I had always knelt. I spoke prayers because the words were memorized, etched into me long before I understood what belief required. I did not feel God listening. I was not even certain I wanted him to. Prayer became a way to structure the dark, to give it edges. The river followed me into these rituals. I found myself thinking of it even in church, its steady movement contrasting sharply with the stillness of the pews. The hymns sounded thinner to me, their promises less convincing. I watched lips move around familiar words and wondered how many of us were speaking out of conviction and how many out of fear of what remained if we stopped. I avoided the riverbank when I could. When duty required my presence, I stayed only as long as necessary, my gaze fixed on practical matters. Yet avoidance did not bring relief. It merely displaced the reckoning, pushing it into quieter moments where it could not be managed with authority or routine. Shame is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles, gradually, until it becomes part of the landscape of the self. I carried mine the way one carries an old injury, careful not to aggravate it, pretending it no longer aches. But certain movements, certain memories, sent pain flaring anew, sharp enough to steal breath. I began to understand isolation in a way I had not before. Surrounded by people, respected in my position, I nonetheless felt profoundly alone. There were thoughts I could not share, not because they were unspeakable, but because speaking them would make them real. Silence became both prison and shield. At times, I considered leaving. The idea came unbidden, a sudden image of walking away from the river, from the role that had come to define me. But the thought never lasted. Where would I go? Who would I be without the structure that justified my days? I had built myself too carefully into the system to imagine existing outside it. The house reflected my inner state more each year. Damp crept along the walls, wood softened, repairs were delayed, then forgotten. Decay, I learned, does not require neglect alone. It requires acceptance. Once you decide something is beyond saving, its decline feels inevitable. I dreamed often of water rising inside the house, filling rooms without resistance. In these dreams I did not run. I watched furniture float, papers dissolve, the past loosen its grip. I woke with my heart pounding and an odd sense of disappointment that the dream had ended. Oblivion, it seemed, held a certain appeal. Yet morning always came. With it returned the familiar tasks, the measured steps, the carefully maintained distance between thought and action. I told myself that endurance was a virtue, that survival itself carried moral weight. Only much later did I realize how often endurance serves as an excuse to remain unchanged. The river did not accuse me. That was the cruelest part. It continued, as it always had, indifferent to my turmoil. In its constancy, I saw reflected the possibility that the world would go on untouched by my regret, and in that possibility, I felt something close to despair. It was in those years of quiet unraveling that my thoughts turned more insistently to my father. He had stood where I stood once, though not at that river, not with that water. Still, the posture was the same, upright, assured, convinced that the world made sense if one did not press it too hard. I remembered his voice, steady and instructive, telling me that a man's worth was measured by how well he fulfilled his station. Questioning, he warned, was a luxury afforded to those without responsibility. I had absorbed that lesson deeply, so deeply that I did not recognize it as inheritance, only as truth. When I stepped into his role, it felt less like a choice than a continuation, a hand placed naturally into a glove already worn to the shape of my fingers. I told myself that this continuity honored him. I did not yet see how it bound me. He had spoken often of order, as though it were a living thing, fragile and easily startled. Disorder, he said, invited chaos, and chaos invited ruin. These words echoed in me whenever doubt arose. They formed a chorus that drowned out quieter questions, the kind that do not demand immediate answers but refuse to disappear. I began to see how sin could be passed down without ceremony, not through dramatic acts, but through assumptions left unchallenged, through silences maintained out of respect, through lessons framed as survival rather than morality. I carried my father's convictions the way one carries a family name, unquestioned, heavy, and deeply entwined with identity. The river, too, felt inherited. Though it was not the same water, it was the same function, the same quiet witness to transactions that reshaped lives. I wondered, not for the first time, how many men before me had stood by such waters, telling themselves similar stories. The thought unsettled me. It suggested a lineage far older than any individual conscience. I felt anger then, not outwardly, but as a low, steady burn, anger at the expectations placed upon me, at the narrowness of the path I had been given. It was easier to direct that anger backward, toward my father, toward the past, than to turn it inward where it belonged. Blame, I discovered, can be inherited as easily as belief. Yet even as I recognized these patterns, I did nothing to break them. Awareness did not translate into action. It merely added weight to the burden I already carried. Knowing oneself to be complicit does not free one from complicity. In some ways, it deepens it. I imagined briefly what it would have meant to refuse, to speak against the arrangements, to step away from the river, to let the system adjust without me. The image felt unreal, like a story told about someone else. I had lived too long within the structure to trust myself outside it. Freedom, I feared, would expose how little I understood myself beyond obedience. The guilt I carried began to feel less personal and more collective, as though I were merely the latest vessel for something long in motion. This thought offered a strange comfort. If the sin was larger than me, perhaps my responsibility was smaller. I clung to that reasoning, even as it hollowed me further. Still, there were moments rare and sharp when I sensed the possibility of rupture, when the past pressed so close that it felt as though it might finally demand something of me. In those moments, my breath grew shallow, my hands unsteady. I waited for courage to arrive. It never did. What remained was resignation, a settling into the knowledge that I had accepted my inheritance without question, and in doing so, had ensured its continuation. The river flowed on, carrying with it the quiet evidence of how easily one life can become the echo of another. I remember now the moments when mercy might have been offered, when hesitation could have shifted the course of events even slightly. I see them clearly: a child reaching back for a mother glancing toward me as if seeking permission I did not have the courage to deny. I could have stepped aside. I could have spoken differently. And yet I did not. I convinced myself that I acted for order, for God, for the system. Each excuse felt heavy, like a stone pressed against my chest, and each one allowed me to continue. The dread in those mornings grew slowly, like mist thickening over the river before sunrise. At first it was distant, easy to ignore, a shadow that receded whenever I approached it directly. But over years, it grew persistent. It followed me into the house, lingered in the hallways, and sat beside me at the table. There was no denying it, no hiding from it. Its weight settled into my bones, as if it had always belonged there. Faith, once a soft and comforting presence, had now become hollow. I spoke prayers not to be heard, but to ward off silence, which had begun to feel more threatening than God's judgment. Each word of Scripture trembled in my mouth, fragile and empty. I knew they could not absolve me. I knew they never would. Yet still I repeated them, as one repeats gestures in the dark, simply to prove one is still alive. The nights were the cruelest. In them, the river came alive in my imagination. I saw faces in its dark moving water, watched pleas rise and vanish, and felt the weight of every decision press down on me. Sleep became shallow, fractured by half-formed memories, by echoes of hands I had touched, bodies I had overseen, lives I had authorized to be broken. Each awakening carried the same taste of regret, bitter and unyielding. I understood with a dreadful clarity how close complicity and cruelty had become. I had not sought to harm, yet harm had followed in every step I took. I had rationalized, justified, ordered, and counted. I had performed rituals and recitations, yet the outcomes were unaltered by intent. Understanding did not comfort me. It condemned me. I was responsible, entirely, and without mitigation. Isolation deepened. I could not speak of these things, not fully, not even to myself at first. To articulate them would have been to admit more than I could bear. So I stored the weight in corners of memory, revisiting them quietly, sometimes unwillingly, letting them fester. Guilt, once abstract, became flesh, moving in my chest, curling around my ribs. It whispered constantly, a companion more faithful than any human. And then, in quiet moments, I faced the truth that mercy had been possible, yet deliberately ignored. The realization burned like fire in my bones. I could feel the choices I had failed to make, the opportunities to soften pain I had refused, and the lives I had left fractured. In those moments, I understood fully the cost of obedience without conscience. The dread became unbearable, a tide I could neither stem nor escape. Memory does not relent. It presses forward with persistence that is both patient and cruel. Faces, voices, gestures long gone, they return with precision, unaltered by time. I relive them as though the river itself forces me to confront each moment, each failure, until I can no longer distinguish between past and present. The weight is constant, it is suffocating, it is inescapable. Prayer offered no solace. Scripture provided no comfort. I sought the counsel of old friends, but words falter against the enormity of silence. I spoke carefully, cautiously, hinting at unease without naming it. And still, each night, I returned to my room, alone, listening to the imagined river, watching my hands tremble in the lamp's thin light, knowing there was nothing left to do but endure. The burden of knowing what could have been done and was not pressed me into a hollow, quiet despair. And even now, as I recount it, the memory does not release me. It does not soften. It remains, unforgiving, persistent, indelible. The last baptism I performed is seared into my memory, as though the river itself had held the moment and refused to release it. I knew, with a clarity that made my hands shake, exactly what would follow. I had seen it enough times to predict each step, each face, each small silent panic. There was no comfort in familiarity, only the certainty that I could not undo what I had done, and that the water, which once seemed to carry blessings, now carried the weight of consequence. The morning was misted and cold. Children lined up as always, mothers holding them close with hands that trembled not from fear, but from anticipation. The current pressed gently against my calves, steady and indifferent. I spoke the words, slowly, deliberately, watching them close their eyes. They rose from the water, shivering, mouths open, bodies wet and trembling, and in that instant, I understood the totality of my betrayal, not just of those children, not just of the mothers, not just of God, but of myself. For years I had hidden behind Scripture, behind procedure, behind the facade of mercy, yet none of it mattered now. The ritual had become a performance, a veneer thin as paper, revealing the stark truth underneath. I was an agent of ruin, a facilitator of pain, a witness to lives broken in my hands. I felt the enormity of it then, more fully than ever, more acutely than any prayer or justification could contain. The river, as always, flowed on, but in my mind its movement had changed. It seemed slower, heavier, carrying not only the reflection of clouds but the echoes of screams I had never heard, and the weight of decisions I could not escape. I pressed my hands to the cold water and felt them tremble. I wanted, impossibly, to reverse what had been done, to grasp at an impossible mercy that had never existed. I saw the eyes of the mothers, and they were not looking at me as they had before. There was no plea now, only recognition, a wordless understanding that what I had performed was complete, irrevocable, and mine alone. My faith, what little remained, could not shield me. My obedience could not excuse me. The river could not wash it away. I remember the silence afterward. The children were led to their fate. I stayed behind, standing on the bank, feeling the current against my legs, aware that each ripple carried the memory of my actions. The stillness pressed against my chest, a weight I could not shift. No one witnessed my hesitation. No one heard the small breaking sound I made a man undone in a world that did not pause. I began to understand how fully sin can become a companion. It does not depart when called. It does not forgive. It sits quietly, patient and exacting, waiting for the moment when you are most alone. It takes your voice, your certainty, your ability to lie to yourself. By the end of that day, I had nothing left but the cold, hard knowledge of what I had done. Every step I took away from the river afterward was heavy with memory. The world outside continued, indifferent. Birds sang, the wind shifted leaves, the air smelled of mud and rain. All life went on as if my complicity were of no consequence, and yet I carried it entirely, painfully, irrevocably. I do not remember when the first tears came. Perhaps it was as I recorded the day's accounts. Perhaps it was in the quiet of my quarters, alone. I allowed them to fall because I could not speak the truth aloud and survive. I cried for them, for their mothers, for myself, for the failure of faith and the corruption of mercy. The river remembered, even if the world forgot. By nightfall, I had realized that confession would not rescue me. The burden of knowing what I could have done differently and did not was complete. There was no absolution in ritual, no solace in scripture, no reprieve in obedience. Only awareness, absolute and terrifying, that I had witnessed, participated in, and facilitated destruction. I knew that this would follow me until breath failed, until memory itself receded into silence. And so I waited, by the riverbank of my conscience, listening to currents that could not speak, and wishing for a mercy that had never existed. The wait was total, unrelenting, and the confession, though inevitable, had only begun. I am old now, older than I ever imagined I would be when I first stood by that river and spoke words I barely understood. My hands no longer hold steady, and my breath comes apart if I try to hurry it. The nights are quieter here, though not kinder. The river is far from this room, yet it has never been farther from my thoughts. Distance, I have learned, does not weaken memory. It clarifies it. I sit most evenings with the lamp lit low, watching the flame bend and recover as though undecided about remaining. Its light catches the grain of the table, the cracks in the walls, the dust suspended in the air. Everything here is worn, softened by time and neglect. I find comfort in that decay. It feels honest. Nothing pretends to be whole. There are moments when I think I hear water not rushing, not loud, just the steady insistence of movement. In those moments, I close my eyes and let it come. Resistance has no purpose anymore. I have argued with memory long enough to know it always wins. The faces return, not accusing, not forgiving, simply present. They exist now without demand, and that, somehow, is heavier than judgment. My faith has thinned to something almost transparent. I still speak the prayers, though I no longer know who they are for. Perhaps they are for me alone. Perhaps they are only a way to mark time, to keep the silence from pressing too close. There are prayers I whisper not because I believe, but because silence frightens me more. Silence leaves too much room for remembering. I once believed confession carried the promise of release, that if a thing were named fully, it would loosen its grip. I see now that confession is not a door, but a mirror. It does not absolve, it clarifies. It shows you the shape of what you have been carrying and asks whether you are willing to look at it without turning away. I do not expect forgiveness, not from God, if He still listens, not from the dead, who owe me nothing, not even from myself. What I seek, if I seek anything at all, is accuracy. To remember without softening, to speak without arranging my words for comfort, to leave behind something closer to the truth than the silence I maintained for so long. The house groans when the wind passes through it, a tired sound, familiar and almost gentle. I imagine the river responding in kind, a conversation carried across miles and years. Wood, water, bone, all of it wears down eventually. Even guilt erodes, though it does not disappear. It becomes part of the foundation, something you stand on without noticing until you try to move. I think often of inheritance now, of what I carried forward without question, and what I will leave behind. I have no children of my own, no blood to receive what remains of me. Perhaps that is a mercy. Perhaps the truest ending to this line is silence. Some things should not be passed on. When my breath falters, when my voice thins to nothing, the world will not pause. I know that now. Crops will grow, roads will be repaired, children will walk paths layered with histories they will never be told. The river will continue its work, smoothing edges, carrying fragments downstream. Knowing this brings no comfort. It only reminds me how small confession is against the vast patience of time. Still, I speak. I speak because silence kept too much intact for too long, because memory, once voiced, no longer belongs solely to the one who carries it. This is not redemption. It is residue. What remains after belief has failed and certainty has dissolved. My breath is shorter now. The lamp trembles. The room feels larger, emptier, as though it is already learning how to hold my absence. I will stop soon, not because everything has been said, but because the body knows when it has reached its limit. The river will remember that is enough. And then there is nothing more to say.